Hi, everyone. So thanks for coming to the webinar. Just a couple of little things before we get started. So you may notice that there's a slightly different client here with us today than what was advertised. Due to unforeseen circumstances, JRL Group had to pull out. So instead, we're very, very excited to have Hydrotec here instead. So we've got Prina from Hydrotec, who will be doing the kind of case study part of the webinar. Another thing is just the Q&A. So we're going to do a Q&A at the end of the session. So if you have any questions throughout, just pop them in the Q&A box and then we'll go back and read them at the end. And the only other thing is there's a couple of polls that we're going to be putting up. If you've been to a webinar with a poll before, they'll just pop up on the screen when I tell you. And then you'll just click the answer that you want and then the box will disappear and we can share some of the results of the poll later. So with that, I'll just do a couple of quick introductions. So I'm Verity Morehouse and I'm a business developer for One-Click LCA, and I focus on our product LCA and EPD side of the business. And then Prina, do you want to do a quick introduction to yourself as well?
Yeah, so I'm Prina Lakhani. I'm an administrative assistant at Hydrotec, and I'm also a second-year law student at the University of Southampton.
Perfect. So before we get started, we're going to do a quick poll. We just want to know where everyone is at in their own EPD journey. You might just be here to learn, and so they're not applicable. But otherwise, let us know if you've created them before, if you're just trying to learn about them, or if you're already an EPD expert. Just give you a couple of seconds to click the option that most applies to you on the screen. Okay. And then a quick introduction as well to One-Click LCA for any of you who don't know who we are already. We are a lifecycle assessment software provider. So that is both for buildings lifecycle assessment and product lifecycle assessments. So calculating the carbon footprint either of an entire building project or of a particular product. Our headquarters are based in Helsinki in Finland, but we've got staff spread all over the world. The software is used in about 140 countries worldwide at the moment. We're not just a software provider, we're also a training provider. So I don't know if any of you have been to our boot camps. We run them a few times a year and they're quite in-depth free training on lifecycle assessment. But also with every software license we sell, we provide training so you know what you're doing in terms of the actual kind of lifecycle assessment methodology, but also the functionality of the software as well. Pretty much work across the whole industry. We work with engineers, architects, manufacturers, builders, investors, etc. Just depends on which software is most applicable to them, and also what their kind of end goals are. So we're going to get started with just what an EPD is. So an EPD is an environmental products declaration, which is essentially an externally verified and standardized description of the environmental profile of a product or material over its lifetime. So effectively, it's a carbon footprint certificate to say this is the environmental impact of my product. They're what's known as type 3 environmental labels based on standards. We'll go into a bit more detail on those standards in a bit, but that gives you a good overview. In terms of why they're important, so just a few statistics on, I guess, the global crisis. So buildings are responsible for about 39% of global carbon emissions. About 28% of those come from operational emissions from buildings, and then 11% come from the materials and construction, so the actual embodied carbon. So in terms of, I guess, the scale of that, so cities are growing pretty rapidly. They're set to grow by about 230 billion meters squared by 2060, and that's generating about 100 to 200 gigatons of embodied carbon. So that's not just from new construction, but it's also from renovation and infrastructure as well, which is the equivalent to building a New York City every day for 34 days until every 34 days until 2060. So it's pretty significant in terms of environmental impacts. In terms of what we're doing about it, so there's already a number of initiatives, regulations, and guidance released to help us meet our targets in terms of carbon reduction. So, for example, there's the London Plan. So within the London Plan, you have to report on, you have to do a building LCA for every mayor referable scheme within London. So that doesn't mean that you have to have EPDs, but ideally EPDs are the most reliable data that's used within those building LCAs. Also in bringing embodied carbon up front, which is the coordinated action plan for the building and construction sectors to tackle embodied carbon. The World Green Building Council issued a bold vision that all construction should be operationally neutral and create at least 40% less embodied carbon by 2030. And then by 2050, new buildings, infrastructure and renovations should have net zero embodied carbon. And then all buildings, including existing buildings and new buildings, should be net zero in terms of operational carbon as well. So just to be clear what the differences are between embodied carbon, operational carbon, and then also whole life carbon. So embodied carbon is effectively all the emissions released right from the raw material extraction until you cut the ribbon on that building and it's ready to start being used. So that's everything, as I mentioned, from the raw materials, transporting those materials, actually manufacturing all of the individual components of that building, and then constructing that building as well. It does also include the demolition of the building at the end of life, and also any retrofitting or kind of maintenance as well throughout the building. Operational carbon then is all the emissions produced from actually using that building, so heating it, using lighting, ventilation, cooling, and just general power use. So if you add embodied carbon and operational carbon together, you get whole life carbon. And why do we kind of harp on about embodied carbon so much? It's because, like, historically, I guess we've always put a bit more of an emphasis on the actual operational carbon. So there's a lot of renewable energy and solar and things like that. But over time, our grids are decarbonising, and therefore the embodied carbon is becoming a lot more of a significant factor. So you can see in this chart here, this initial kind of peak at the very start of the building's lifetime is what we refer to as the kind of carbon burp. So this is all the carbon released before the building's even used. And then over time, you can see the operational energy year on year, and over time that is going to reduce. You can also see there's a few little pink parts here, and this is for replacement parts for the building. So as Peter Drucker famously said, you can't manage what you don't measure, which is why EPDs come into play. They're obviously a very reliable carbon building block for a building life cycle assessment. So it can help us manage and measure the upfront carbon in our construction. In terms of what a life cycle assessment actually is as well, this diagram is quite a nice one for just highlighting all of the different stages. So it's a standardized methodology. It's broken down into life cycle stages, which are numbered as A1 to A3, which is your raw material extraction, transportation to a manufacturing site, and then also the actual manufacturing energy. Then you've got stages A4 to A5, which are your construction stages. So transporting to a construction site and then installing the products. And then the use stage, so any use, maintenance, repair, replacement parts over the lifetime of the product or building. And then the C1 to C4 is the end of life stage. So deconstructing and then waste processing as well. So in terms of the methodology, so life cycle assessments are a structured and standardized methodology associated with measuring the impacts of all the life cycle stages of the building. They are a quantitative analysis, so they're based on numbers. You can have life cycle assessments for buildings, and then you can have life cycle assessments for products as well. And then life cycle assessments for products, you can go a step further and create an EPD, so you can get it verified and published in line with the standards. So we often like to think of EPD data and the data that goes into it a bit like a cake, because we like cake and we like to refer everything back to it. So if you were to create a cake, you would need a list of ingredients that go into that, and then all of those ingredients would have calories associated with them. And then you would also have electricity and water to actually mix and cook that cake as well. Once you've got the cake made, you'd be able to know exactly how many calories are in the entire cake because you've got all of those calories associated with the ingredients, and therefore you can know exactly how much damage it's going to do to you if you were to eat it all. Similarly, for buildings or for materials, if you were to create a building, instead of having a list of ingredients, you would have a list of materials or a bill of materials. Each of those materials, if they had an EPD, would have a carbon number associated with them. If you then add them all up and obviously you apply the energy and water to actually create that building, you would be able to then know the exact carbon impact of the entire building itself in terms of embodied carbon. If you didn't have a carbon equivalent associated with each of the materials, there's no way of you knowing how much impact that entire building has had. Again, when you actually look at an EPD, this is an example of an EPD results table on the right-hand side. So we like to refer those back to food as well. So it's a little bit like a nutrition label, but with reference to environmental impacts rather than actual ingredients or calorifics. So on a nutrition label, you've got your serving information, your serving size. In an EPD, this would effectively be your declared unit. So for example, if it was flooring, you would use a declared unit of a meter squared. If it was maybe concrete, you might use meters cubed, or you could use kilograms. So it's whatever the most suitable unit of measure is for that particular product. Then you've got your calories. So in an EPD, this is effectively your total CO2 equivalent. So that's the number that most people refer to as your total CO2 equivalent for your A1 to A3 phases. And then here you've got all of your nutrients. So in an EPD, this would refer to other environmental impacts. So they don't just look at global warming potential or CO2 equivalent, they also look at other things like ozone depletion, acidification, etc., etc. So that's pretty much it on the introduction. I'm going to hand over to Preena now, who's going to talk about her experience creating EPDs using the One Click LCA EPD generator software and the process of that, basically. So I'll hand over to you, Preena.
Thank you, Verity. So just as a small introduction, Hydrotec is a German industrial water treatment company that has been operating in the UK for over 30 years now. We provide equipment for scale control, bacterial control, and water filtration, and also work on bespoke projects and offer maintenance contracts, regardless of how large the property is. We have equipment all over the UK and also sell internationally, both for large companies, large buildings, and smaller buildings and individual homes. So there are a few reasons why we have started to use EPDs, the first being for research. Knowing the environmental footprint is encouraging us to become more carbon neutral and make our products more environmentally friendly, leading the way in our market. The second reason is transparency. Our customers are increasingly asking about the environmental impact, and we want to be upfront about it. It also helps companies with their non-financial reporting, which is especially important for listed companies and audits. So we initially started with the subsea TM65s, but they can be manipulated, so they aren't really as trustworthy. We didn't take into account the use stage with TM65s and found it easier to consider all variables with EPDs through one click. EPDs also calculate the impact of the manufacturing processes, not just the materials used, so the full life cycle is considered, meaning they're more accurate and detailed. Getting our EPDs verified and completing cradle-to-grave EPDs means there's more accountability and accuracy in our reporting. And as a result, our customers find us more reliable, and we can also know whether we've made any mistakes along the way. And last but not least, in the EPD, there are sections where you're able to explain exactly what was considered and the processes undergone to calculate the product's environmental impact, and also any emissions when doing so. So it just adds a bit more context to the data shown. The customer isn't just then looking at numbers, they're understanding the whole life cycle and the whole story of the product. So when creating EPDs in-house, there are a few reasons that you could do it. The first being that it is cheaper. It can cost a lot more to create them externally. The second is that this is a bit more personal to us, but Hydrotec's products can be a bit difficult to explain to others. So it just made sense for Hydrotec to keep it in-house where there's no need to train someone else on our products. And even if this training would be minimal, it's just easier to keep it in-house, really. By keeping the process in-house, updates are also easier to complete, as are new EPDs. This also goes back to training new people. By using an internal team, it's easier to train others on the creation of EPDs, and the training can be kept more specific to the products and processes your company use. So this is what we're doing at Hydrotec. I'm going to be training other members of the company on how to create EPDs, and I'm actually creating a list of everything that is relevant for our products. So all the raw materials, all the processes that are for them, things like that. And this actually helps to streamline the process in the future as well, because whoever is making the EPD won't have to go looking for the relevant materials and processes. Personally, I also think it's easier to keep track of progress if the task is completed in-house, and timeframes can be more realistic as a result. If you know how long it's taking you to complete an EPD, you can adjust your expectations for the future. So in terms of how we use EPDs, creating EPDs is essentially step one to the process of becoming more environmentally friendly. By creating EPDs, we are making life easier for our customers through providing information that they need for end users, and it's critical for our consultants to win business too. Sorry. Making EPDs forces us to continuously update the data on our products and forces us to look at each individual part of the life cycles. I think the best part about creating EPDs is that it shows you the impact of every part of your product, like how it impacts the environment. So we're using this knowledge to better understand where our products' life cycles can be changed to lessen our environmental impact. And overall, EPDs are allowing us to create a more sustainable future. So I'm now going to walk through the actual process of creating an EPD and some of the challenges that we face throughout, including the data collection, onboarding course, template, completing a full range, verification and publication, and completing additional ranges with a bit of averaging in there as well. So starting with data collection, you've already seen this diagram, but just to explain a little bit more about what goes into it. This is actually the most important part of the process, but it can be a bit time consuming. It's better to have too much data than not enough though. So spend your time on this, really make sure that you're getting everything you can. We collected this data over the course of about a year, and there are various modules that must be covered in it. So there's the A1 to A3 product stage, which is about the raw materials, the processes used on them, the transport of the materials, and the raw materials and transport of the packaging as well. A4 to A5 is the construction stage and is about the transportation and installation of the product, including the disposal of the packaging. We had limited data for this and used an approximate distance from our manufacturers to London because our manufacturers are in Germany. We sell our equipment across the whole of the UK, so we couldn't really use a more specific distance, but if you can, it is better too. B1 to B5, the use stage, is not always covered in the EPDs, but we chose to include it to the best of our ability. We included the energy and water use for our products as this has had a significant impact on our carbon emissions, but this can be tailored to whatever your product or building is. And finally, there are modules C and D about the end of life stage and the benefits and loads of the end of life, which I don't believe module D is shown on the diagram, but it is important to bear in mind. With this section, we had to make some assumptions based on UK data because we're not personally involved in the disposal of any products, and many of ours haven't been disposed of. Our head of business development and sustainability recently found one of the very first hydromags ever sold about 30 years ago, which was very interesting to see. Module D, that was probably the hardest to get my head around, but this is where the template and the onboarding course really helped. I'll talk about those in a bit more detail, but for now, I'll just say that we had wood chippings and incineration as part of our EPDs. So calculating the recoverable energy from this was quite difficult to understand and learn in general. But the template showed exactly how to do this, and our mentor, or teacher, mentor, whatever you want to call it, explained why we did these calculations as well. So after collecting all the data, we did the onboarding course, and I can honestly say it's fantastic. So the course included online lessons throughout which you complete a full EPD for one product. And we had meetings after every lesson to go through the work and correct mistakes as required. And I'm so grateful to OneClick for their help throughout this. We opted for the 10-week course at Hydrotec, as we wish to complete at least one full range as fast as possible. So when I say range, I mean range of our products in our business. I actually managed to complete the course in about 3 weeks and publish a full range after a month, which is certainly a task, but that was from start to finish, from the beginning of the onboarding course to publication. The 10-week course meant that I believe it would have meant that we would have completed one lesson and one meeting per week. Obviously, completing it in 3 weeks didn't quite go like that. We had a couple meetings a week, and I would do, I think, 1 or 2 lessons at a time, depending on what the lessons were. From this, we actually also have additional support hours, and we've continued to use them throughout when publishing other EPDs, and we'll be continuing to use them in the future as well. So moving on to the template. The template was really helpful for us, as we believe we are the first, or at least one of the first, industrial water treatment companies to create EPDs, and it helped me know if I was on the right track when making ours. Some of the modules, it was actually really necessary because of the calculations that we had to do, like for the wood pallets and incineration, like I mentioned earlier. We provided information for our most complicated product for the template because ours had to get made specifically. And they laid out exactly how it should look, including the comments and energy balancing, which was incredibly helpful. So there are some existing templates already, but we did have to get ours specially made as there was not a template similar enough to our products. And OneClick completed this within about 2 weeks, which is, I believe, is a record for them. So we have covered the data collection and onboarding course. So let's talk about completing an EPD and a full range of products. We did one full range to start with, which included 8 products in our high mag range. I've got a few photos on the screen. These are CAD drawings, but it can give you an idea of what it looks like. The one at the end here is impossible to bring. It's about 600 kilos, so we can't really show that in person. But the reason we did this is we wanted to publish them all at the same time, and it's a stable range for us. The onboarding course is only one product, but depending on how similar your products are, this should be sufficient, or at least it was for us. I used what I learned in the course to complete the other products in the range and our other ranges. One of the products, the one at the end, the heavy one, is the DN100, and it was a little bit different to the others. It was only a couple materials and processes. I think it was a crate and aluminium instead of a wooden pallet and a plastic. And so we did have to change those bits. But our teacher was incredibly helpful and we used our additional support hours for this. We submitted all 8 products in this range in one go, and it actually worked out slightly cheaper to do this as well. And the verification process was also a bit quicker and easier as a result. So the final stage, we published with EPD Hub and did so through the OCLA website, which is a helpful part of the software. You can submit an EPD straight from the software to EPD Hub to get it verified. We checked the EPD with our mentor before submitting it to see if there were any mistakes in our data, mass balance, or descriptions. And the actual verification is a simple enough process. We did have to make some changes, but they were painless. So, for example, changing the data point for electricity or adding additional explanation in some of the comments. I actually had to explain that we didn't have water use for some of our products because they treat water, not use it, which was a bit funny, but it gives you an idea of the kind of comments that we'll expect to see. So they might just want to understand what the product is. And overall, the process was quite simple, and it became a lot easier as I kept doing it. Part of this is because I made fewer mistakes, but it becomes quicker in general too. So the other ranges that we've completed were easy enough to do as well, following the process that I'd already learned and making changes to certain data points and details as required, learning from the comments from the verifier. But averaging was a little bit different. So there were 2 ranges that we had to complete this for, and I hadn't done this for our first range. And I had to look back at the onboarding course, but it's good that they keep that there. You can still refer back to it as time goes on. So I looked back at the onboarding course to understand averaging and calculated the percentage averages based on the product's relative weights. There are a few ways of doing this. This is how we personally chose to. So if there's one product that weighs 60 kilograms and another that weighs 40, it would be a 60-40 split if those were the only two in the average. Sorry, all this talking is making my throat dry. And it also helps to have the expert license to complete the averaging. So it was at least the raw materials that it worked for, but it shows you can create two designs and then average those. And it gives you an idea of what it should look like, and it can even calculate the percentages for you. So overall, we have completed 29 EPDs covering 4 ranges and 1 standalone product over the course of 2 months. We will be using the results in the long term to discover how best to reduce our impact on the environment and how to become more carbon neutral. We're also planning to do this for 4 additional products. So sorry. We're planning to do this for 4 additional products in the short term, and we're going to continue using the one-click software when doing so. And finally, I hope this has helped you understand the process a bit more and why EPDs are so useful.
Thanks, Prina. That was really good. Building on what Prina's gone through, I'm also just going to go into a little bit more detail on some of the rules that you have to follow. She's mentioned some of them, like the averaging, but just to go into that a bit more, all EPDs are governed by what's called a program operator. So they basically ensure that they are done in line with the standards, and that they're verified as well. And they're also responsible for hosting a public library of all published EPDs. So there's probably 50 plus program operators out there. It could be, for example, EPD Hub, who we work particularly closely with, or it could be the International EPD System, and there are lots of others as well. So there's 2 key documents that program operators create. So one is the general program instructions. So they're the basis of the overall administration and the operation of the program, such as the process for product category rules and EPD development, and then verification, the content, and then the format of the EPD as well. And then also product category rules. So they can create specific rules for groups of products, which basically ensure you're comparing apples with apples. So if going back to the flooring example, if one manufacturer uses a declared unit of meters squared and the other one uses a declared unit of kilograms, then when you're comparing them, it becomes very hard to know which one is greener. So product category rules outline a lot of things, but one of them is a declared unit. There aren't product category rules for every single product out there by any means. These can be developed. So if they don't exist, then you would refer back to the EN 15824 standard for EPDs for construction products, and there would be no kind of complementary rules to that. Go on to the next one. So in terms of the standards as well, so EPDs do follow a number of standards, including the ISO 14025, 40, and 44, and then the EN 15804 for construction products, and then the also ISO 21930 as well. They're verified in accordance with the ISO 14025. They're life cycle based. Pretty much the whole of the world follows the 15824 standard. The only exceptions to that are the US, France, and Holland. They follow slightly different rules. We have all of the results in the software for them, but it's just worth considering. If you do have a large client base based in the US, France, or Holland, you'd probably have to publish a separate EPD to satisfy them. Another thing I wanted to go into a little bit more detail on was types of EPDs. So, for example, you can just have a third-party EPD, or a parent EPD. This is just your standard EPD for a single product. You need at least 1 year's worth of production data to produce these. You can then have a sister EPD. So a sister EPD is like a variation of an already published parent. So say you had 5 products that were really similar. You didn't want to average them into one product, or maybe they weren't suitable for averaging, but instead you wanted to make sure they were still linked. Then you could produce a sister EPD. And they are a little bit cheaper to publish as well than just a third-party verified. And it's worth saying they can't vary more than plus or minus 50% in terms of their global warming potential compared to the parent EPD. They have to have the same manufacturer, same end use, and about 80% the same materials as well. Then there's what's called a design phase EPD. So if you have not been producing a product for a year, and so you don't have a year's worth of production data, then you can produce a design phase EPD. They only last for 18 months rather than the 5 years that a normal EPD would last. But you don't need more than a month's worth of production data to produce them. So great for new products, and then in a year or 18 months time, you can get them re-verified with your full year's worth of data to turn them into a full EPD. And then a project EPD, generally you would produce these for a specific project or a client if they have quite a bespoke assembly. So they only last for 36 months. Obviously, you don't want to be doing this on every single projects that you kind of sell your products to, or every single client, because it can become quite time consuming, quite expensive. But they do have their place. So if you are providing something that's really bespoke for a client and they particularly want you to have an EPD for it, then a project EPD would be the best route to go down. And then to add on to that, Prina mentioned averaging. So any of these can be averaged. Averaging can then be for a number of reasons. So you can have just a single product, single manufacturer EPD, or you can have an industry averaged EPD. So that could be where there's lots of manufacturers and you're averaging all of those manufacturers results into one EPD. So there's quite a few industry averaged EPDs out there. For example, there's one for clay bricks. You can also have a product grouped EPD. So they might be similar products in your own range as one manufacturer, but multiple products. So you can average those. And you can also have industry averaged product group EPDs as well, just to complicate things further, but they're not quite as common. So in terms of who uses EPDs and why they're important for the future of manufacturing. So they're used by a number of people. So they're used often in building life cycle assessments. So they're used by architects, designers, engineers, developers, etc. Firstly, to compare materials and source more sustainably. So that could be right at the early stages of a project where you haven't yet decided on what materials you're using yet, and you might just be using comparing different materials to say, right, if we use this one, it would have this much carbon in it, and if we use this one, it would have more or less. They're also used in the later stages, so actually in procurement and when you're specifying particular products. So maybe you've decided that you want to use wood fiber insulation, and now it's down to getting to the nitty gritty of which wood fiber insulation manufacturer has the greenest product. So actually comparing manufacturers side by side as well. They're also used to adhere to sustainability compliance standards such as BREEAM or LEED. They actually get credits for using products that have EPDs, so it can help them to achieve those higher standards. And then, as I mentioned, to actually conduct the whole life building LCA. So again, that could be early stages, or it could be right through to as built and reporting on exactly what the emissions of that total building are. So in our software, we're the only central database for every single construction EPD. So if you publish an EPD, it should be in there, no matter whether you've made it with us or not, it should be there. So manufacturers can type in a product, search for it, and then select it, include a quantity, and then that becomes part of their entire building assessment. We've also got a number of benchmarking features in the software as well, so they can actually compare products side by side, or they can see where a particular product sits within an entire industry, within a country or globally as well. They're also used by manufacturers. So this could be to compare and benchmark themselves against competitors. So Prina mentioned there aren't many other manufacturers in her industry yet that have EPDs. So they are obviously a bit of a front runner in that. But if they did have EPDs, then it would be good for Prina to be able to compare her products with her competitors, see where potentially she could reduce the impacts of her own. And then also used by suppliers. So, for example, Prina's products may have steel in them, and Prina's steel supplier could have an EPD themselves. So that enables Prina to select a very accurate data point for use within her own EPD. So you can use EPDs within EPDs, if that makes sense. So they're used for actually calculating EPDs themselves, and then also as a marketing tool. So obviously EPDs are in high demand by architects, developers, etc. So having them available is quite a nice way to get your products to stand out from a sustainability perspective. And also just in the software. So if you've got architects looking for bricks in the software, they'll type in brick and everyone with an EPD will come up. So it's giving you exposure to all of those client bases for you as well. So we've got about 80 of the top 100 architects in the world using the software at the moment. This is just a slide to show how they might be used in a building lifecycle assessment. So often, because you publish an EPD as a PDF, you think that people are just looking at your PDF. That's not necessarily the case. If you're using a lifecycle assessment software, normally those EPDs appear as data points. So within our software, we've got these data cards. It enables people to be able to download the EPDs if they want to see the PDF, but otherwise they've just got a snapshot of all of the information that's in there. So they can see the background information to that data point, where it's been published, a description of what the product is, and then they can also quickly see the environmental profile of it as well. Just lastly then, a bit on our EPD generation software. So the whole idea of the software is to enable you to bring your EPD generation in-house. It's much cheaper than potentially outsourcing it, but also it gives you complete control over your data. It allows you to kind of manipulate your data suitably rather than kind of just doing an EPD to tick a box. You can actually use the information. You've got more, I guess what Prina mentioned earlier is that if your products are quite complex, you've got a very detailed understanding already of what goes into your products. So it can be a bit easier. So within the software, you would collect your data. So your data, as Prina mentioned, is things like your materials you're using, where you're getting those materials from, transportation distances, and then the energy you're using in your factory to create your products, and then also waste as well. And then the end of life phases you would declare generally on scenarios. You then input that data into the software in terms of quantities. You pair that with an appropriate carbon data point. So the software's got about 30,000 carbon data points in there. A lot of that data comes from EPDs, but also a lot of it comes from EcoInvent, which is a big global generic database where you can pick generic carbon data points for things like materials, emissions, and waste. It will automatically do the calculations for you. So it will do your LCA and it will create your EPD report as well in line with your program operator. So we've got pre-verified templates already for EPD Hub and the International EPD system. And then we send it to be verified and published as well, providing you want us to. Obviously, the software as well can be used for an R&D tool. So if you don't actually want to publish every time, you can use it to do internal calculations and see, what would happen if I replace this product or this material with this one, or what would happen if I replaced my energy supply with solar or renewable energy. So you can use it as a bit of a tool to see how you can reduce your emissions as well. in terms of the process as well, so Prina did go through this roughly earlier, but obviously you would have your onboarding. We would create, or we would already have templates available in the software for you. So these are basically pre-done lifecycle assessments with a generic similar product to yours. You can then go in and tweak that data to suit you. So it's a nice example to start with rather than starting from scratch. And then obviously there's the verification and publication as well. Most of our clients are now using EPD Hub. It's a lot more streamlined. It's very quick to publish, so it's generally 2 to 4 weeks. And also you can submit directly from the software to EPD Hub, and they can see all of the background data in the software rather than having to produce what's called a background report. And then the last little piece here is, it's quite a busy slide, but it's just quite a nice summary of what an EPD journey might look like. We'll share these slides later, so if you wanted to actually read it in a bit more detail, then you can do. But effectively, the first stage of creating your EPDs would be your EPD development strategy. So who would be inputting this? This might be marketing or business development. They might say, right, we need these EPDs because we're getting a lot of demand for these particular products, or these are our best selling products, or maybe you've got one of your products involved in a particular tender where they're asking for EPDs. So it's about developing a clear strategy for how many EPDs you want to produce, in what time frame, and then also which products you want to target as well. The next stage would be to do your product grouping. So we can help with this, but hopefully in the training you'd have a good understanding of all the rules around averaging and scaling, etc. But it's understanding the differences between your products. So normally this would be a technical team or an EPD team or something like that. Understanding the differences and similarities between your products and deciding if you want to group them or if you want to keep them separate. This can also have an advantage for forecasting costs. So if you know roughly how many EPDs you're going to publish and whether they're going to be averaged or not, you can have a good idea of how much they're going to cost to verify and publish as well. The next stage is your data collection. So this could be anyone in the company. EPDs can be a pretty collaborative project. So you'll be collecting data from technical teams, factory managers, suppliers, understanding where you're getting products from, the buying department potentially as well. You'll input that data then, and then hopefully you'll have a full set of data required to complete your EPD. Stage 4 then is your actual EPD generation. So inputting all of that information into the software in a compliant standard. So manipulating that raw data. So maybe you've got your total factory energy and you need to be able to transfer or allocate that back to a particular product. So it's about changing that format of the data, inputting it into the software, and then producing a compliant EPD. The step between 4 and 5 here is eco design. This is obviously optional. In an ideal world, we would hope that everyone was using the software for eco design. The whole point of doing this is that we want to be able to measure, manage, and reduce our emissions. So hopefully you would be using it for that as well, whether that's for new products or existing products. And then 5th is the last part, is actually using your EPD. So you've probably spent a lot of time creating it. You've probably spent some money developing it as well. So you want to make sure you get the best use out of it. So you need to make sure your marketing and business development teams are promoting them, making sure that all of your suppliers know that you've got them. You might not realize that your suppliers actually need them or see them as a valuable tool. So yeah, just making sure that they're out there and they're being used as well. And that is pretty much it from me. Before we move on to our Q&A, we've just got another poll that we're going to pop on the screen. So if you would like to have a demo with any of us or learn a bit more about the software, please click yes. If you do not, please click no. If you click yes, we probably will contact you. So only click yes if you definitely do want to actually see the software and learn more. It should be on your screen now. So the next part is just Q&A. Before we go into looking at your questions in the chat, um, I've just got a few questions for Prina, which I think would be quite useful for people to know. So the first one, I guess, is what drove you to start creating your EPDs in the first place?
Yeah, so we had actually been receiving requests for EPDs, TM65s, or some kind of life cycle analysis for a few years. And then our head of business development and sustainability started with the Subsea TM65s. And he's been looking at starting EPDs for a while now. And it finally happened last summer. And it all went from there, really.
Perfect.
Yeah.
And you yourself didn't have any experience in doing life cycle assessments, did you?
No, I didn't. No.
Did you have any experience in, like, I guess, sustainability, or was it all completely new?
The only time I had ever learnt about it was my GCSEs. So other than that, I had nothing else to go off of. I think that was actually one of the challenges that we faced, that I personally faced as well. So
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. I mean, you did incredibly well to produce so many EPDs. Um, so I guess what were the biggest challenges you would say, other than the not knowing, I guess you just said not knowing much about sustainability, but what were
Yeah.
your other biggest challenges for actually creating them?
Yeah, so I mean, I was obviously not really knowing about sustainability. I've said it before a couple of times. I think people are getting sick of it. We are one of the first in the industry to do so. So it wasn't much to go off of in terms of actually how it should look. But I think one of the biggest things that I struggled with was even just finding the correct data points when I was doing it. A lot of the time I had to go in and kind of manually add them onto our company account into a separate data list, um, which was a bit of a struggle, just trying to figure out exactly what was applicable for our products. Again, that goes into me not knowing about sustainability and about the specifics of these. I'm not a super technical person, but
Yeah, yeah.
again, our mentor was really helpful with that. So.
And was that, so that was mainly finding the data points that were specific to you, or was it actually finding the data as well? Because you collected that data quite quickly. How did you
Yeah.
already, did your company already collect that, or were you starting from scratch to go and get it?
So uh, we had been looking at that and compiling data for it for a while already.
Yeah,
We had to continuously be in touch with our manufacturers and ask throughout the onboarding course, we were continually asking them, can you specify exactly what type of plastic this is and things like that.
yeah,
We also did have to make some assumptions with that because whilst we are one of their main like suppliers, I think is the right word. They do sell other products, and we can't always account for that in terms of factory level data. We did have to use factory level data a couple times, more for energy than anything else, and we didn't have like the full weight of the product or like however many products the factory made in a year. So we made some assumptions for that, and we had to keep asking them again. So that was a bit of a
sure.
struggle.
Yeah, yeah. No, we often hear that obviously the longest part of the process is quite often collecting the data. Um, the onboarding training is over a period of time to enable to be able to get data between sessions, so you don't necessarily kind of need to have got it all to start with. But yeah, it's definitely sometimes a bit of an oversight as to how much time the data collection takes. And the actual EPD creation is generally a little bit quicker. Um, Obviously you were able to produce, I think it was about 26 or 29 EPDs, or maybe even more, in about 2 months, which I think is probably a record. So what, and obviously your products are complex as well. It's not like you were creating EPDs for really simple products. So what was your secret to being able to create so many?
Just a lot of time and dedication, really.
Yeah,
It was uh, I had a very strict deadline as well. Had to go back to university in October, so it was juggling
yeah,
working on EPDs from around late August and early September, and then trying to quickly finish them as fast as I could. It wasn't
sure.
really. There's no like a trick to it. I don't think. You just have to learn the content as best you can and learn from mistakes. That's that's all the advice I can give on that, really.
Sure. So it was a kind of a full-time project for you for those 2 months, I guess.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah, it was.
And then the last one, I guess, is what are Hydrotec's plans for the future? So will you be producing more EPDs? Will you be bringing out any new products? Or do you think you'll use the software tool for research and development?
Yep. So in the short term, we are looking at producing more EPDs. We have at least four more products um, that we're set that we do want to create EPDs for. We're always looking at how to better improve our environmental impact, and I think this is going to help our manufacturers look at that too. And they're also always
Yeah,
coming up with, well, they're all making up ideas on how to improve our products and any new products that we can make. So, but
perfect.
that's a bit out of my depth, to be honest.
No, that's absolutely fine. Okay, thank you. It was really interesting. We'll go into now the Q&A box. So if anyone does have any questions, then pop them in there. I'll start with one at the bottom here from Rohit. I don't know if that's how you pronounce your name. Sorry if it was wrong. But if you want to create EPDs for cement manufacturers in Cambodia, for example, where baseline data is missing, how do you go about this process and how to start? So to create EPDs for cement manufacturers in Cambodia. So if you wanted to create EPDs for a manufacturer, no matter where they are located, you would have to be able to get some manufacturer specific data from them. So in terms of baseline data, I don't know if you mean the data points or the actual kind of the quantities of materials and the manufacturing emissions, but you would need to be able to go to that manufacturer and say, you know, what materials are you using, what quantities of materials, and you'd need to be able to get that first-hand information from their manufacturing site as well. In terms of the data that you would use, there are generic data points for every ingredient that goes into cement. There's tons of EPDs out there for cement, so the data is there. So you would use that generic data if the suppliers of the individual ingredients do not have EPDs. So that's how you'd go about it. Obviously, you wouldn't expect all of your suppliers to have EPDs. It's just at this stage in time, it's not realistic. Hopefully, in the future, it will be. So using those generic data points, normally from somewhere like EcoInvent or industry averaged EPDs, are what you would do in that case. Adam Green. So what types of data are you collecting over the course of a year to create an EPD? What happens if you're in a country where such data is unavailable or expensive to obtain? So over the course of a year, so you wouldn't necessarily have to collect this going forward. You can look at retrospective data, so you can say what was our last year. So you would need to look at the materials you bought, what types of those materials you're buying, the quantity of the materials you're buying, and how much of that material is going into each product. You'd also, one of the main ones that's, I guess, probably the harder ones to collect is the manufacturing energy. So you would need to say, right, our factory used this much energy over a year. If you make lots of different products, you would have to allocate that energy back to a specific product and a specific declared unit. So there's a number of ways to do that, which they go over in training, but one is mass allocation. So you look at the mass of your products that you're looking at, and then the mass of all the products you produced over the year and allocate it in that way. Another one is done on value, so the actual value of the product as well. So that's the kind of data you need to collect. In terms of the country where such data is unavailable, I'm assuming you're not talking about the actual manufacturer data, because there will always be manufacturer data. Sometimes getting it can be hard, but you should be able to look at that factory and get those energy emissions. So again, I'm assuming that you're referring to the actual data points. And again, you would use the generic data. You don't have to use country-specific generic data. There's also global averages that you can use. There's European averages. So there would always be something there that you can use. If you're doing a really obscure specific product and the data does not exist, which can happen, you would either use a proxy data point, which is like a similar data point to what you would have used, and we can advise on those. Or potentially you might be able to get in touch with your supplier, and if they could do a life cycle assessment, you can input that as a private data point into the software as well. So the other one is, does the tool have specific data for India? Yes, it does. So there are specific data points for various countries. There aren't generic data points for every single country out there, which is where you would use the global or the European averages. But in many cases, there are some for countries, and I know that we do have some for India specifically as well. Do you have templates for plastic products? Yes, we do. We've got templates for various plastic products. I do not know them all off the top of my head, but plastic pipes are one. We've got different plumbing parts and equipment. We've got plastic flooring, plastic doors and windows. So yeah, we've got various ones. If you did want to have a full list, we've got a link which I could send you if you wanted to get in touch, and it's got a full list of all of our templates available. If we don't have one that's perfect for you or your products, then we can create them with additional support hours. So it's like a consulting project for us to create a bespoke template for you, and it will save you quite a bit of time. And then here's one from Jacob. So do you think it's possible to do calculations directly in the model, for example, in Revit? You have your EPD data in parameters with automatic calculations connected to your dimensions in your building project. Do you see any project disadvantage with this? So if you are a architect, designer, engineer, and you want to do a building LCA, we have a two-way integration with Revit. So you could basically export an entire Revit model into the software. It reads the quantities of the materials you're using, and it also reads the naming convention of that material, and then it automatically pairs it to what it thinks is an appropriate data point, and it basically does your LCA for you. You can then obviously go in there and you can tweak those data points if it's not quite the right one, and it will remember those naming conventions then and the pairing with the data point. So next time that you import, it will map it directly to the one that you mapped it to previously. So yeah, it's a huge advantage to do that. Obviously, it's massively time saving. It means you don't have to go in the software and find every single data point for your building. We've got about 16 integrations with various different softwares. Currently for the EPD software, we don't really have any direct integrations. We do have an import form, which a lot of companies prefer to use. It's Excel based. So you collect your data in the import form and then you can import that into the software. Sometimes it can be a bit quicker to kind of tweak quantities or copy your data and tweak it slightly in the import form. Also, if your software has like a bill of materials that you can export in Excel format, you can export it into the import form and then import it into the software. So definitely a time-saving feature. And no, I wouldn't say there's any disadvantages with doing it. Couple more minutes left and just a couple more questions, so I'll try and be quick. So Alice says, hello, great webinar. What exactly is the difference between EPD Hub and the EPD International? So they are just two different program operators. Neither of them are kind of any better than each other. There's just about 50 program operators out there. So they're different bodies that basically verify and publish EPDs. The main differences, I guess, would be their product category rules and their general program instructions. So they have slightly different allowances, I guess, when it comes to averaging, scaling. So for example, EPD Hub allows a plus minus 50% variation in global warming potential when it comes to averaging products, whereas the international EPD system allows a plus minus 10% variation. So that's kind of some of the differences, but the nitty gritty of it would be in the actual program operators' general program instructions. So how are EPDs verified regulated? Are they open to manipulation? So they are verified by verifiers. So every EPD has to have a third-party verification. So we do not do that as one-click LCA. That's why we pass to EPD Hub or sometimes the international EPD system. They're regulated against the standards, so the verifiers are going to be checking that you have adhered to all of the standards, that you've input all of the data that you should have input. They are obviously not going to know down to an exact T if everything you put in there is perfect. You probably won't know either, but they have a good idea of the kind of figures that they should be seeing. They've verified thousands of EPDs. So if something looks not quite right, then they're going to be questioning you on it. If data is missing, they'll question you on it. Likewise, if you're saying you're using 100% renewable energy, they might ask you for copies of your energy certificates and things like that to prove it. One last question here before we finish. So no need to collect data such as wastewater or CO2 emissions or manufacturing waste. Yes, you do need to collect that information. So you would, again, look at your total annual energy bill and how much water you used, and then allocate that back to your particular product or declared unit. CO2 emissions would come under process direct emissions, which are a part of the life cycle assessment. So if you are producing gases during your production process that you have to report on as a factory, you would have to include those in your assessment. So you would need to be able to measure those, and the same with waste as well. If the data points are not available, how many data points can use generic data before the EPD becomes unrealistic? So in terms of the data points you use, there's no limit to how many generic data points you can use. Obviously, the quantities of that data is factory specific to yourselves. The actual data point you're using can be generic. EPDs are not an exact science. They're as good as you can possibly get with the data that is available. There's about 30,000 data points in there, so we would hope that you could get it as accurate as you could. But in the absence of product or manufacturer specific data, generic data is absolutely fine to use. And then I will just do this last one because it seems unfair to leave one question. So how did you define the range of products that you created EPD? Did you group them? And if yes, what deviations are accepted from the EPD provider? So I guess, Prina, this might be more one for you, actually. How did you define the range of products that you created, and how did you group them?
So when I'm talking about a range of products for an EPD, I'm talking about a range that we sell and then creating EPDs of those. So we have a high mag range. We created, that was our first range that we did. We created individual EPDs for all of those and then submitted that for verification. And then we repeated that for our other ranges as well. If you're talking about averaging, that's slightly different. We had to try out a few different things for the two ranges that we did average. We can, because of there are certain requirements about averaging. It's a 50% change in something. I'm sorry, I think Verity will have to give more specific on that.
I'll just tune in because it's a 50% plus minus variation in terms of the global warming potential, and that's how you could decide if you could average them or not, basically.
Yeah, so we had to look at that and play around with some of the products to see what would make sense to be put together, and also does it even work? But that's very specific to you and your products.
Yeah, great. Okay, and you published with EPD Hub, which is why it was a plus minus 50% rather than the 10% with International EPD System. The recording will be shared. Sorry, we've gone slightly over on time, but thank you everyone for coming, and I hope it was useful. Bye.